I'm not going to rush the service tonight, but I am going to keep us at a pretty good pace because actually we may cover 2 chapters tonight. Chapter 25 is where we're going to begin tonight, but chapter 26 don't contain several verses, but a portion of it again is Paul's testimony, and we're not going to get into that. We've already discussed that a couple times, and so that'll leave us with 2 chapters. So I'm going to try to cover both chapters tonight. And as we begin chapter 25, if you remember, as we closed out in chapter 24, it says in the last verse, "But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room." And I don't mean his bedroom or his living room. It meant that he was placed as procurator in his place. So he succeeds Felix. And Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, leaves Paul bound. He leaves him in jail, in prison. So he is there, leaves him there for 2 years. And so he's there under Felix. Felix knows that the charges that are brought against him are false. There's no evidence for these charges, but he wants to stay on the good side of the Jews. He wants to be reelected, which it don't matter because somebody's going to stab him with a dagger, and he's going to die here not too long from now anyway. And but he was a rotten guy anyway. So Festus comes in, and he's put in his place, in his room, in his stead, and he is actually placed there by Nero. And so, by Caesar. So when Festus comes in, that's where we begin chapter 25. So let's read the first few verses. "Now when Festus was come into the province," so when he comes in as the new procurator, as the new governor, into the territory, after 3 days, he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and chief of the Jews informed him against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him, that he would send for him to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. "Let them therefore," said he, "which among you are able, go down with me and accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him." So when Festus becomes governor at Jerusalem, he immediately goes up to Jerusalem, and on the 3rd day after that he takes up his duties, he decides to visit the city. So he's leaving Caesarea and he's going up to Jerusalem. Caesarea was kind of the seat of civil government. That's where he would rule from. And so the visit is a courtesy visit to the religious center of the Jewish people. And but Festus must have known about the situation of the tension between Felix and the Jews there at Jerusalem. So no doubt he wants to go up, meet these Jews that are in Jerusalem, let them know, hey, new guy's in town. I'm better than the guy that was before you. We're going to make this thing work. I want to find out what you all need, and I'm going to try to supply it for you. So when he does this, members of the Sanhedrin take advantage of this occasion of Festus taking this new office, and they come and bring these charges against Paul. Verse number 2 there. "Him being in prison all this time had not cooled their hatred for him." It's been 2 years, and they have still. I mean, it's been 2 years, and they still want to kill Paul. It's been 3.5 years, and they still want to kill Trump. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. They have got a political hatred for this man, and it is festered rather than got any better. So they're determined to try to destroy this man, and they're bringing charges to Festus and hoping that maybe he'll show some kind of special favor or kindness to them. But a trial in Jerusalem among Paul's enemies would be probably the worst thing that he would want to do. He could have been tried in a Roman court, either at Caesarea or at Jerusalem, but the real intent that these of the Sanhedrin want him to bring Paul to Jerusalem to be tried is because they want to ambush him. when he gets on the road and they go to traveling, it's like an old John Wayne Western. We got to get them out of the jail, and sometimes they couldn't get them. They had to sit and wait for the marshal to come. And so in a polite way, when they ask for that, Festus don't know at this time that we know of that they had a plot to kill him. But he's in charge now. He politely refuses their requests and says, no, we're going to keep him here at Caesarea. So the chief priests and Jewish leaders have given the impression that they want to try him as soon as possible. So he tells them in verse number 5, come down with your leaders, and that is literally means men of power among you, anybody that's got any kind of power or authority. Come on down, and if you accuse this man, come on down and we will bring these charges against him in a formal way. So Festus decides to keep him there in Jerusalem. Beginning at verse number 6. When he had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. They couldn't prove them under Felix. And if he had give Felix a little money, Felix would have let him go. Felix was waiting on him to give him a bribe, but Paul wasn't going to do that. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews or against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. But Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, now that's the same thing Felix did, trying to stay on the good side of the Jews, answered Paul and said, will you go up to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these things before me? Festus is saying, will you go to Jerusalem? They want to try you in Jerusalem. Let's go down there. You won't have to stand in judgment before them, but I will be there to hear your case. But Paul said in verse 10, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I be an offender, have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof these accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, hast thou appeared unto Caesar? Unto Caesar thou shalt go. So Festus remains in Jerusalem for 8 or 10 days. He goes back to Caesarea and immediately begins to make arrangements for the trial. The following day, Paul is brought before Festus, and when he gets there, his accusers lodge many grievous complaints against Paul. But because now that the case is 2 years old, it's hard to find eyewitnesses. So they don't have these guys. If you remember, the eyewitnesses were Jews from Asia. They've already went back home. It's been 2 years now. So these guys from Jerusalem were not eyewitnesses, but they were going on secondhand information and accusing Paul. So this delegation from Jerusalem has to be satisfied with generalities. So they don't have a lawyer to speak for them like they did. Remember when they went before Felix, they had Tertullus, an orator, kind of a lawyer of sorts. He made the best that he could out of a bad case. But Paul's enemies were succeeding in making charges against Paul. They were successful in making them sound very serious, but they couldn't support them with any real evidence. So the lack of evidence shows that the accusers, the extent that they would go to try to accomplish their ends. So Paul pleads not guilty to every one of the charges. And in Luke's brief account of the defense, Paul declares himself innocent of 3 charges. First of all, he says that he's done nothing wrong against the Jews. Ever since I've been in Jerusalem, I arrived there with the elders. They told me that there were many that believed, but there were many that was teaching or spreading a rumor that I had forsaken the law of Moses and teaching other people to do the same thing. So Paul's saying that I've not done anything against the law of the Jews. I've not done them any wrong. And then he said, I've not profaned the temple. Remember, they made accusations of him because they seen Trophimus in the temple with Paul, and they assumed Paul had taken him into the inner court, to the Jewish courts, the word that no Gentile was allowed, but they assumed it. They never could prove it. And then he says, I've not profaned the temple. And then he denies committing any offense against the Roman government. So if you remember in Philippi, there is the girl with the spirit of divination, and they brought him to the magistrates saying that these men have customs that are not lawful to receive, and us being Romans. But Paul affirms that he was innocent, not only in respect to Judaism, the law and the temple, but he's also been a law-abiding citizen under the law of Caesar. So the charges of sedition against the emperor in Rome, they have serious political implications. But Paul has preached Jesus as the Messiah. The message could be understood by Festus as a threat of peace and allegiance to Caesar, but Paul is so confident that he is not guilty of causing a rebellion. He's so confident in his innocency, he says, I appeal to Caesar. And so the Jews make their allegations, but they fail to be able to prove them. So after Festus hears all the charges that the Jews bring against Paul that are obviously have no weight, no meaning to them, he's ready to hear Paul's defense. And he's starting to realize that Paul should have been released a long time ago. As a Roman citizen, they don't have anything against him that's worthy of death. So, but like his predecessor, Felix, he is not as much concerned about this man, Paul, the prisoner, as he is this Jewish community where that he needs their support to be able to stay in position. So he asked Paul if he's willing to stand trial in Jerusalem in verse number 9. And he says that's where that your accusers are and where they say these crimes were committed. And if you look back verses 4 and 5, when they asked him to go to Jerusalem, Festus said, no, we're going to stay here in Caesarea. So now he's reconsidered and thought, I might be in good standing with the Jews if I take him up to Jerusalem. And so now he asked Paul, how about we go to Jerusalem? Paul said, you know what, I'm done with this foolishness. We've been through this. I stood somewhat of a trial before Lysias, before Felix, now before Festus. And he's unwilling to submit to have his trial heard in Jerusalem where all the people hate him. So Paul says, I'll appeal to Caesar. So Paul reminds the governor that based on the trial in Caesarea that Festus knows. Paul said, you know that I'm innocent. You know that there's nothing, all these are trumped up charges, and I'm innocent. And it shows that Paul suspects Festus, like Felix, is trying to win over the favor of the Jews, which he was. So Paul insists that he should be tried before a Roman court, and he appeals to Caesar. Verse number 11, Festus confers with the council, with his advisors, and perceives that the appeal stops. When he appeals to Caesar and a Roman court, it stops all the local proceedings there in Caesarea. It really transfers the case now to the imperial court in Rome. So by him appealing to Caesar, it pretty much stops Festus from having being able to do anything. The exact details of this type of appeal process is not really known, but because of the appeal, Festus is required to send the prisoner to Rome for trial. So through his legal procedure, God's plan for Paul to bear witness in Rome is being carried forward. So by honoring Paul's appeal, Festus unknowingly makes it possible for Paul to be a witness in the great city of Rome. So it's not Festus that's sending him there. It's not the Jews that's sending him there. But all along, it's the hand of God that told Paul, you will be a witness to me in Rome. So they can't stop him from going to Rome even if they wanted to. So in verses 13. After certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. Oh boy, here we go. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's case to the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priest and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. To whom I answered, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they were come hither without any delay on the morrow, I sat on the judgment seat, commanded the man to be brought forth. Against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. So Festus is repeating what we've just read in the first 12 verses. He is repeating what has took place under King Agrippa II. He is coming to kind of congratulate Festus on his new appointment as procurator. And, you know, it would be like the president coming down and congratulating our new Kentucky governor, that makes governor. It'd be like the president coming down. Maybe not the president. He didn't have that much political power, but he was an elite figure in the political realm. So before that Paul is sent to Rome, Agrippa II arrives with his sister Bernice. They arrive in Caesarea to pay the new appointed Festus a courtesy call. This was Agrippa II. He's the only son of Herod Agrippa I. If you remember him back in chapter 12, he was the one that killed James and wanted to kill Peter, because when he killed James, he realized it made the Jews happy. So he wanted to kill Peter, but God got him, the Lord delivered him out of jail and got him set free, and he hid for a while. And but this is the son of that Agrippa I, King Herod Agrippa I. But he's also the great-grandson of Herod the Great. You remember Herod the Great? And he is the brother of Drusilla, which was the wife of Felix, and he's also the brother to Bernice, who accompanies him to Caesarea. Now, the Romans have given Agrippa II the right to appoint a high priest and supervise the temple and the funds. But he's also king of some districts in northern Palestine. He's regarded as an expert in Jewish affairs. So Felix and Festus really don't know much about the Jewish religion part, about their laws. And if you notice, Festus called it a superstition, their beliefs, and their whatever. But Agrippa has knowledge, because remember we talked about the Herodian family, Herod the Great, and the Herods that had come down the line. It ends actually with Herod II here. But they all have come through the birth of Christ, John the Baptist, James. So this family's been around a while, kind of like the Clintons. I mean, they've just been there. They just keep handing it down to family, and nobody else can get in. So for generations, this whole family's come down the line. And so they would have been familiar with all of this stuff. Agrippa knows more about Jewish affairs. Matter of fact, by Rome, he was put in charge of the temple and its funds. So he's a little more knowledgeable of Jewish lifestyle and what goes on with their religion. So this visit gives Festus an opportunity to let Agrippa hear Paul's case, because Festus has to send Paul to Rome, to Caesar, and when he goes, he has to be accompanied by a letter of charges. And Festus has no charges. Nothing, I have no evidence of anything. And he stands in jeopardy of trouble himself if he sends a prisoner to Rome without any accusations. So Festus says, hey, the king's coming here. If I can get him to accuse Paul of something concrete, I can put it in writing, and, that will relieve me of the trouble that I could get myself in. So Festus wants to present him in good light to his royal guest. So Festus then tells Agrippa that Paul had refused to move the trial to Jerusalem, so he exercised his appeal to the emperor. So Festus has ordered his soldiers to keep him in custody till he could be sent to Rome. But Festus' description of Paul's case intrigues Agrippa. And possibly, like I said, the king, I believe more than likely, had heard about Paul. He'd at least heard about Jesus and the way and these Christians. His father, Herod Agrippa I, had tried to suppress the Christian faith by killing James and imprisoning Peter. And he said, I would like to hear him myself. And the word like literally means in the Greek, I was desiring, which suggests that Agrippa had entertained the desire to hear Paul for some time. So Agrippa comes probably down the line and heard something about this going on in Caesarea. Verse 23. On the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, and if you'll notice, every time Agrippa is named, Bernice is with him. Remember, this is his sister. And yes, it's bad or worse than what it sounds. They were having a very inappropriate relationship. I guess he was so ugly he couldn't find another woman, and maybe she was dumb. I don't know. But so here comes Agrippa the king with his girlfriend and sister with great pomp, and entered in the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city. At Festus' commandment, Paul was brought forth. Festus said, King Agrippa and all men that are present with us, you see this man about whom the multitude of Jews have dealt with me both at Jerusalem and here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. When I had found he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I've determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write to my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, especially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have something to write. After you hear him, you might find some reason that he's guilty. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. Don't seem right to send a man to be tried when I ain't got nothing to accuse him of. Chapter 26, verse 1. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. Then Paul stretched forth the hand and answered for himself. So the stage is now set, and Paul's grandest defense speech is about to be given. And he appears before King Agrippa on this occasion. And King Agrippa II is the most important dignitary before who Paul will formally speak throughout the book of Acts. He is one of the most important dignitaries, or the most important dignitary that Paul speaks before, recorded in Acts. As a prominent Jew, Agrippa is well versed in the Jewish religion and Jewish ways, so he may be able to give some advice or at least some useful comments on the case. He might be able to see something that Festus was not able to see. So Paul's meeting with Agrippa takes place the next day after Festus had spoken to him about him. And it is an occasion of pomp and ceremony with splendid audience and fanfare of Oriental kings and public gatherings. You know how it is when, we're living on bread and food stamps, and then here comes the motorcade and with all the bodyguards, and, it's all with great pomp and splendor, and all the dignitaries are there. The scene is set, and Festus orders the soldiers to bring in the prisoner into the hall. And you have little humble Paul, and you remember the only account that we have of what Paul may have looked like: short, stumpy, bow-legged, unibrow, bald, and he can't see good. So here they bring Paul out, before all this grandeur and before all this pomp and splendor. And he stands in glaring contrast to all the pride of the magnificent audience. And nevertheless, Paul stands at center stage, and he's the main actor. And for the Christian reader, he is the most important person in the room. So the proceedings are conducted with formality and dignity, and Festus opens the meeting with a brief statement. He recognizes the presence of his royal guest, Agrippa, and then he introduces Paul's case to his audience. And in the introduction, Festus says that the whole Jewish community, not just the leaders, but all of the Jews, has brought charges against this man. Jewish mobs have called for Paul's execution. And apparently on this basis, Festus claims that the Sanhedrin actually was representing the will of the people, what our leaders and congressmen are supposed to do, who rarely do. So Festus admits that the apostle should have been released because the people that accused him should have been there face to face, but we can't find them. They didn't show up. So he hints that he was even going to release him. But before I could release him, he appeals to Caesar. Baloney. He wasn't going to release him. Felix had him in there for 2 years. So Paul's appeal presents a difficult problem for the governor. He has to submit substantial charges to the emperor about why he's sending this prisoner up. The absence of evidence once again makes a point that Paul is innocent. Festus don't know what to write to the Roman emperor, and he would be in big trouble if he sent him up there and didn't have a statement designating the charges that was against Paul. The problem's real, and his audience can see that the governor is in a bit of a predicament. But it's a problem of his own making. He held a man that was entitled to freedom and kept him bound. So to escape the dilemma, he hopes that Agrippa will hear him, and maybe that Agrippa will save him from great embarrassment if he could just declare Paul guilty. So by the courtesy of Festus, King Agrippa takes control of the meeting in verse number 1 of chapter 26, and he's acting as the chairman of the proceeding, and the king gives Paul permission to speak. He allows Paul to speak for himself. Let's read verse 1 again. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, You're permitted to speak for yourself. Then Paul stretched forth his hand and answered for himself. I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because I shall answer for myself this day before thee, touching all the things whereof I am accused of the Jews. Especially because I know thee to be an expert in all customs and questions which are among the Jews. See, he was knowledgeable of the Jews and their religion. Wherefore I beseech thee to hear me patiently. My manner of life from my youth, which was at the first among mine own nation, at Jerusalem, know all the Jews, which knew me from the beginning, if they would testify that after the most straightest sect of our religion, I lived a Pharisee. And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made of God unto our fathers, unto which promise our 12 tribes instantly, serving God day and night, hope to come, for which hope's sake, King Agrippa, I am accused of the Jews. Why should it be thought a thing incredible with you, that God should raise the dead? I verily thought with myself that I ought to do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth, which thing I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints did I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priest. And when they were put to death, I gave my voice against them. And I punished them off in every synagogue, and compelled them to blaspheme. And being exceedingly mad against them, I persecuted them even unto strange cities. So Agrippa tells Paul, you can speak for yourself. Give your own defense. Paul stretches out his hand, probably as a gesture of respect to the distinguished audience that is there, and he begins to speak. And he politely acknowledges King Agrippa and considers himself fortunate to be able to finally have somebody to hear him that knows about the Jews and what is going on. He's an expert in Jewish customs, not like Lysias and Felix and Festus. He's acquainted with the faith of the Jews, insomuch that the emperor has actually entrusted him with over the religious affairs in Jerusalem. So Paul's implication is that Agrippa's knowledge of the Jewish religion will enable him to be able to see what's going on here and see that it's all just a farce. So as Paul begins his defense, he's aware the audience is made up mostly of Gentiles, but he directs his speech to Agrippa and primarily the Jews. His intent is not to deal with the charges of the Jews. There's no need to deal with it because he's not done anything with them. Festus himself has declared that he's not done anything that has broken Roman law. So the occasion gives Paul an opportunity to show himself loyal to what he considers to be true Judaism by showing his Pharisaic heritage. In verse 4 of the story of his early life, generally known by his people, he said, from my youth, the people in my own country in Jerusalem know how zealous I was for my ancestry and the Jewish religion. I am a Pharisee of Pharisees. And the Pharisees were a group that had pledged to live strictly according to traditions and customs and the religious observance of Jewish law. So Paul is on trial, but he's committed no apostasy. He's on trial by his own fellow men, his own fellow Jews, saying that he has done things that are wrong against the Jewish religion. Paul saying, I'm more of a Jew than they are. I lived harder as a Jew than they have. And as he believed as a Pharisee, he still believes. And he still believes that what God has promised to our fathers and the 12 tribes, it is his hope in the fulfillment of the divine promises that God gave to his ancestors. And that is why Paul said that I'm standing on in this trial today. He's a defender of the resurrection hope and makes the victory of the risen Christ Jesus over death the basis of his message. He is turning this thing around from all these false accusations that they made they can't prove. He said, this is why that I'm really on trial, because Jesus rose from the dead and they don't believe in the resurrection. But why would we not believe in why would we not believe that God raised Jesus when we believe in the resurrection? That's the point that Paul is making. He's making them to understand they're contradicting themselves. So for Paul, the denial that God raised Jesus from the dead is the same thing as denying the general resurrection. So the Jews have no valid reason for denying the resurrection of Christ. That God raised him from the dead might seem incredible to the Gentiles, but it shouldn't be for the Jews, especially the Pharisees, because they believed in a general resurrection. Sadducees did not, remember? So continuing on, Paul describes his past life, and verses 12 through 19, he tells the story of his conversion. Again, I'm not going to read all that. We've read that a time or two already. He gives a brief review of his career as a persecutor of the Christian way. And in his zeal, he sought to suppress the Christian movement in Jerusalem. He had the authority of the chief priest, and he put many of these people in prison. And he didn't just confine his efforts and his hunt for these Christian people to Jerusalem, but he said, I even went to strange cities. I went as far as I could go to foreign cities. So the details of this account varies a little bit from some of the others, but Paul tells Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly call, the heavenly vision. Matter of fact, the obedience to that vision is what brought me before you here today. So, beginning with verse 19, after Paul gives his testimony of how that he was saved and how he come to know the Lord, he said, whereupon, O King Agrippa, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision, but I showed first unto them of Damascus, and at Jerusalem, and throughout all the coast of Judea, and then to the Gentiles, that they should repent and turn to God, and do works meet for repentance. For these causes the Jews caught me in the temple, and went about to kill me. Having therefore obtained help of God, I continue unto this day, witnessing both to small and great, saying none other things than those which the prophets and Moses did say should come, that Christ should suffer, and that he should be the first that should rise from the dead and should show light unto the people and to the Gentiles. And as he thus spoke for himself, Festus said with a loud voice, Paul, you're beside yourself. Much learning doth make thee mad. So the message that the Spirit-filled Paul gives to Festus causes him to cry out. Festus, as a pagan, is unable to understand Jewish theology. And especially with his reference to the resurrection. Belief that a dead man rose from the dead is incredible to him. So with a loud voice, the governor declares, Paul is out of his mind. Son, you crazy. You've been locked in a room studying too long. It's made you mad. And he ain't nothing but a deranged and religious fanatic. But Paul denies the charges of insanity. What he has to say about the Christian teachings and experiences that he has had is true and reasonable. And Paul says, you know about these things. And we can speak. Verse 25. But he said, I'm not mad, most noble Festus, but speak the words of truth and soberness. For the king knows of these things, before whom I speak freely, talking about Agrippa, for I am persuaded that none of these things are hidden from him, and this was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, believest thou the prophets? I know you believe. Then Agrippa said unto Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. Paul said, I would to God that not only thou, but also all that hear me today were both almost and altogether such as I am, except these bonds. When he had thus spoken, the king rose up, and the governor and Bernice, and they that sat with them. And when they were gone aside, they talked between themselves, saying, this man doeth nothing worthy of death or of bonds. They all agreed to it. Then said Agrippa unto Festus, this man might have been set at liberty, if he had not appealed to Caesar. So Paul denies the charges that he's crazy, and Agrippa tells Paul, he said, man, after listening to you, you almost persuade me to be a Christian. Was he serious about that? Was Agrippa serious about that? Apparently, the exact translation has it difficult for translators to be able to dissect that. But by using the word Christian reveals, by him just using that terminology, reveals that Agrippa knows something about the way. He knows something about this Christian sect. He knows, he has heard about this before. But the best we know, he chooses to remain an unbeliever. Almost persuaded, don't get you in. So Agrippa concludes the interview, and the meeting has been convened at his request. And when with the king and all the others that were on the platform brings the meeting to a close, the dignitaries leave and they engage in a conversation based on what they have heard from the Apostle Paul himself. Especially, I believe, with the tone of sincerity and honesty of Paul's speech. Agrippa and Bernice confirm what Festus had already declared. They're convinced he's innocent. And he's not done anything deserving of death or even imprisonment. So from a Jewish point of view, Agrippa expresses his regret that Paul had appealed to Caesar. So this is a reminder that Festus had not acted wisely, continuing the trial and holding Paul all this time, and for Felix leaving him locked up for 2 years. And the governor finds himself in the same predicament. Now he's under obligation to send the prisoner to the Roman emperor, and he don't even know what charges to state against Paul because nobody there can find any either. Nobody really knows what Festus wrote to Caesar. The question remains, why did Festus just not set Paul free? Rather than try to come up with a lie for the emperor of fake charges, why couldn't he just say, I can find no charges to send this man to Rome? I'm not sending him to the emperor looking like a fool. But like many of our politicians, he wasn't man enough to do that. He's not going to offend the emperor and commit political suicide. So God's appointed servant, the great apostle and witness, for some time he's wanted to go to Rome, the capital of the Gentile world, but he probably didn't know he was going to go under these circumstances. He goes in chains as a prisoner of Rome. And in a vision, in chapter 23, he had been promised that he would testify of Jesus in that city. Divine guidance is about to guide him on a journey to Rome. He'll enter into the city as a prisoner who has appealed his case to Caesar, but not as a condemned criminal. He has been pronounced entirely innocent by Festus, Agrippa, and all the dignitaries that were there that day. Amen. So that brings us to the end of chapter